So here we are again together talking about childcare. So we're just going to spend a few minutes with Joyce on some more thoughts on childcare financing and ways we can think about this. And then we're going to leave childcare and talk about provider taxes and then a charter change. We're going to have a few, I think there are a few local option tax charter changes that are coming our way in the next week or two. So get ready to have the same conversation a few times in a row. And with that, Joyce, would you like to join us? And Nolan, if you sit wherever you want.
Thank you and good afternoon. I am Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office. It would be hard to change identity from day to day, but nevertheless. Okay. I'm connecting to the Zoom meeting, I think. Then I will, oh, there I am. And then I will share my screen.
While that's getting pulled up, is there something on our page?
Yes. It's under my name.
If you don't see it, refresh.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was moving ahead too fast in the timeline and I'm good now. Thank you.
Very good. So today the chair has asked me to think about a timeline for early care and education and public pre-K. So sometimes I think the public pre-K should be considered part of early care and education. And sometimes I think that we need to specify that we're thinking about both items. So you have this document, or you can watch it on the screen.
And I think I would, in an ideal universe, families would see it all as one thing. But the back end is that we're funding them from two different places. So this committee needs to think of them separately.
And I imagine that some families would get 4-year-old care and after pre-K, public pre-K care all in one place, and some families would have to go to two different places. So here we are. Okay. So I'm talking about a goal of high quality, accessible early care and education. And in order to illustrate that goal and how much work we have to do to get there, I'm going to use what Rand called their Schedule 2 to illustrate that high quality, accessible program. And it's not terribly far off from where we might end up as a state, I believe. So I think it's a pretty good model to use. So it would maintain the CCFAP. I'm now going to train myself to say CCFAP features that include no copay for families up to 150% of the FPL. And you can see the amounts there if you need a refresher. And the weekly copay would start at $25 for incomes just above 150% through 175%, and then increase by $25 at each bucket. So the next bucket up would be $50 and so forth. The goal is a family copay no more than 10% of income up to 350% of FPL. If you remember the chart yesterday, we saw that in fact the current system does see families paying more than 10% of their income above about 250%. But that's a worthy goal, and nonetheless. And RAND continued CCFAP eligibility up to 500% of FPL. And you'll remember that as you get higher up, the subsidy from CCFAP is smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm not missing very much if the state decides to continue beyond 500%. Okay, so the RAND report did a lot of great things, but one of the good things they did is identify the funding gap in order to get to that sort of a high quality accessible program. And that was identified as about $260 million in 2022 dollars. Okay, so a year ago, it would have been $260 million. if I move that forward to 2024, which realistically is when we're thinking of instituting the beginnings of that high quality accessible program, the cost might be about 288 million. So I'm using an inflation rate for 23 and 24 of about 5.5%.
If I look at the charts from yesterday, would I be looking at this to see what this is described?
Nope, I don't have a chart of the RAND Schedule 2, but there are charts in the RAND report, and it's not very, well, okay, I'll stop there. There are charts in the RAND report, and I haven't modeled anything precisely like it, but it's similar to getting all the way to the high quality cost of care. They would have a different schedule, so the sawtooth pattern would look different.
Would look different.
Yes. Okay, so in order to get there, we need new investments as a state to support that expanded and more enhanced CCFAP program. So the thinking from the chair was that we might think about getting there over 4 or 5 years, over some period of time. If we think about $288 million divided by 4, that means that we would be adding about 72 million to the CCFAP system each of the 4 years. I'm thinking about it in 4 year chunks, 1 year chunks for 4 years. So we have that expense. We would also have administrative startup costs for the Department of Children and Families, because they would be handling a lot more applications and dealing with many more families, and we hope more providers as well, certainly providers with more slots. And also maybe for the Department of Taxes, because we probably want to have some sort of sustainable funding system that could be slowly ramped up over time to provide for these additional costs over time. Additional investments, I should say, over time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The 288 million, what happened to the 645 million from the RAND report? Because that's what I got as a number for per year of $2022.
645 million, I believe, is the amount that we are currently spending. Or maybe it's the total amount.
It's the total.
Okay, it's the total amount that we would need to spend, but we are already spending, plus the federal government is supporting a lot of our spending.
I see.
So some of that, and families too, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, families too, right? Let us not forget. Yes, so take away the state, the federal, and the family payments and any other. Right.
But this, the
That's
280.
the gap. That's the gap that would have to be filled.
The 288 million
Yes,
would bring care workers up to, they would be getting the benefits and the salary of people in education fields, and schools, public schools, right? So it's doing all that.
it's getting to the high quality program that,
Okay,
Yes.
and I understand. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I would hope that the simple arithmetic result may disappoint reality or vice versa, because I suspect that some of those years will be lumpy. In other words, some years will be 120 million, some will be 42 million, and just whatever the trigger is or the mechanism over the 4 or 5 years ought to yield to some flexibility. I don't know that, but I'm supposing it's not just linear.
so it is true that we also have some preparatory work to do. And so I'm going to talk in the next bullets about one-time payments. But once we get the structure in place for revenues and for implementing the expanded system, I think at that point we carry on, right? So there'll be more and more in the base spending each year, but we'll have the underpinnings necessary to move ahead, I think.
Okay.
There will have to be some additional administrative costs perhaps included in the base as things expand. But I think that's all part of the 288 and
Startup.
maybe the 72 of each, so we'll see. Okay, so I talked about the one-time administrative startup funds for the two agencies, and also the providers will need some one-time readiness payments and grants in order to get their facilities in shape and hire more staff and get the training that they need for their staff and all of those good things. So you can think both of base payments going forward and also some one-time amounts of money. Okay, so that's early care and education. And we also have the public pre-K idea that's coming along. So public pre-K, I imagine, is to be paid out of the education fund. The issue there is that not every school district is ready to offer public pre-K. And so there may need to be a few years in which we get them ready, right? And something else complicating this time schedule is that there is going to be a facilities survey done. The legislature will get that report back, I think in November maybe of this year. At that time, the legislature will have to decide how to fund the updates, the renovations, the expansions, maybe the tear downs, who knows, whatever has to happen. So all of that will take time. And you would sort of want to roll this pre-K physical capacity into those renovations so that everything gets done as it needs to get done at the same time. So that's the thinking behind maybe a few years before public schools would be ready. Going along with public pre-K might be some one-time administrative payments and grants for the Agency of Education, and also maybe for supervisory unions and school districts who have to gear up to offer this. And also perhaps one-time readiness payments and grants for local schools. So those are some things to think about. Okay, so here for discussion purposes only, I am showing you fiscal years and July of calendar years because I always get mixed up, so it's nice to see these things lined up together. So let's first realize that FY 2024 starts this July, right? July 2023. So if we are going to be ready to take the first step toward expanding CCFAP and paying a bit more to the providers and having more slots and so forth for July of 2024, that's the 25% step toward high quality early care and education. Then that means starting this July, we would need to put in place preparations for that early care expansion. So then we move to July 2024, we might institute or implement that 25% increase. When I say 25% increase, I hope you all know that means 25% of the way towards the grand high quality budget. Yes. Yes. So that's the 72 million. I should also note that I'm carrying forward 2024 dollars as 72 million, even though I know there's going to be inflation and that 72 is going to grow to 73 or 74 or whatever going forward. It just got too complicated in my head to look at numbers and say, how did I get to 150 if I started with 72? So, okay, so yes, those numbers would change a bit going forward. And at some point we can prepare those numbers for you to look at if you'd like. Okay. Now we move on to July of 2025, which is FY26. We're up to 50% of the way towards the early care and education goal. And we're thinking of.
So in the same sense, 100% changes too, doesn't it? Because in year one, 100% is different than it will be in year 4. Who does the counting?
So when we have legislation, I would think there would be something that says an inflator, would move these numbers ahead year by year, linked to some index.
But in this, I'm thinking in the local school, they would do the counting, a student count. Somebody would have to, because how do we know how many desks to buy? And boxes of crayons.
I see, you're asking a different question. Okay, yes, the Agency of Education would have to keep track of the number of students
And they,
who are expected, yeah.
and they do that every year in order to get the daily membership
ADM.
and the ADM, and then there's the average ADM, and there's like a whole procedure that Brad can come in and talk to us about if you want.
Okay, yeah, I think, yeah, okay, we
They-
can put Brad in.
They count students.
What I know is old, so yeah,
My guess is they have not changed the system very much, but we will have Brad in.
okay, that'd be good. Yeah.
Okay, so in July 2025, we might think about preparatory work for the public pre-K, so that would be a one-time expenditure perhaps. So then we're moving to July 2026. We're still at 50% of the way towards early care because we didn't take another big step because we were doing public pre-K in that year. So now we've got public pre-K.
And then at that point, I would imagine that the 50% there is actually, if it wasn't inflation adjusted, would be a lower amount than the 50% dollars.
Yes, so I'm thinking about how to estimate an offset from public pre-K because we would then have X percent, whether it's 80% or 60% or whatever it is. Let's say it's 80% of 4-year-olds. Is it just 4-year-olds? Yeah, just 4-year-olds. Okay, so 80% of 4-year-olds would be in school for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, which means they would not qualify for CCFAP during those hours, right? If they then went to an after-school program or a early care and education program for 4-year-olds, for the remaining hours of the day, they might qualify for CCFAP. But from the state's point of view, it would be a lower cost for that CCFAP, right?
The general fund.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's right. So the education. That's right. Yes.
I'm just saying, like, why would more kids enroll in public pre-K? I mean, you're still on a 35-week schedule, right?
It's true, but at least it's 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, rather than 2 days a week.
So
2
you gotta
days.
find a provider for the other 17 weeks, and that's the problem. That's why
Well, that's what,
kids are enrolling in private pre-K right now. Okay. Okay.
Yes, that's absolutely an issue.
but it's an issue that people deal with kindergartners and first graders and second graders and third graders.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they have to. Pre-K
It's
is
tough, yeah.
Back to the exercise of choice between the pre-K that's offered and the CPAP. That makes a financial difference, as you pointed out. I'm curious, though it's a policy decision, what AOE may do to incentivize schools to expand their public pre-K. It's, for budget purposes, it needs to be more than a possibility. It needs to be something predictable. Do we have any way of
Yes.
asking, what?
So I believe that the thinking is that the weight on pre-K children is now 0.46.
Yep.
And it would increase to 1, just like a kindergarten child is 1.
Okay.
Right? It would be full-time students, just like kindergarten kids.
Okay. But still, it's the locals who will decide whether to go down that road.
Yes, although the bill may say that we are requiring,
That's where,
Right now, we require 10 hours. It could require,
that's where I was sort of anticipating. I think we're gonna have that conversation.
and there's still the discussion about mixed delivery, so they might contract, a local school district might contract out with a private provider if they don't have the facilities or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
Okay.
Would the district's pre-K payment to a private center increase?
With the district's pre-K payment, I would think so.
I hope so.
I would
They're not
certainly
gonna
hope so.
send anybody, they're gonna send everybody out and skim the whole thing.
Yeah, better.
I imagine-
Neutral.
I imagine it would move closer to the average announced tuition, because then it's a service and it's a full day service of the, right? It's a contracted service with the district the same way. Did you have a?
We just need to make sure that we're not pulling high-value students away and not fixing the whole financing systems at our centers that have relied on the students can still function too.
Also, and
The intent of providing the 10 hours of UPK was to like help support the finances of the system. It did create a higher value for UPK eligible kids, which meant that, and that was sort of helpful for some centers to have a few more students who had a higher reimbursement rate. And if we pull those out without addressing the financing of our younger kids, it makes the math less work. And we don't want to create a tension, right, where people are like fighting over the high values. So we want to just make sure everyone has the resources they need to offer the high quality care to everybody everywhere.
And of course, part of moving to high quality care is reimbursing for actual cost of care. And if you were reimbursing for the actual cost of infant care and toddler care, then you wouldn't have the cross subsidization problem. So that's the thinking. Now, we're not all the way there by 2026, July 2026, so we still have to worry about that issue, absolutely.
Yeah, make sure it's a smooth transition.
And not winding up in the situation that we have with our CTEs, which is sort of a similar situation where we're disincentivizing the sort of most equitable place because of the financing structure. And that, I think, is why the public pre-K doesn't kick in until there's a lot more stability in the system a few years out. Representative Anthony.
That it reminds me of our discussion about the takeaways from career technical ed to try and make sure the incentives are neutral in terms of sending or not sending. And ditto here in the choice between the two.
Absolutely. Right, so
I'm all set.
good, okay. So we're just about at the end of the timeline here. So July 2027 would go up to 75% of the way towards high quality early care. And then finally in July 2028, we might be all the way there. Good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, to start the revenue discussion, it helps in my brain to think about ongoing investments and separately thinking about one-time spending. So we've got ongoing investments in early care and education that are rising over 4 or 5 years over this time period. We've also got public pre-K that might begin in the middle of that period. So you have to think that each of those years, your base funding is going to be rising, right? You continue where you were and you add more each year. So that's going to be a challenge. And public pre-K presumably would be funded through the education fund, and that might mean an increase in property taxes, which could happen. Who knows how the one-time spending would happen, but it might begin before the actual full day, full week public pre-K happens. So that's something else to think about because there are issues surrounding property taxes to consider. Okay. We've been through the one-time spending, the prep for early care and education, the prep for public pre-K, and maybe also start up for a new tax structure through the tax department if that's the way the legislature goes. Okay, there are some revenue sources. The House FY24 budget set aside $50 million in the base for this coming year, right, for FY24. They also set aside 21 million in one-time spending for early care and education. So there's 71 million to be spent in FY24 for early care and education. You all might also think about some additional tax type or maybe an add-on to an existing tax for early care and education. And you might think about some additional property tax revenue or other sources of revenue for public pre-K going into the ed fund.
Thanks.
Am I done? I think I'm done. Oh, this was just in case somebody had a question about that. But otherwise, I'm done. Thank you.
Put that at the end of all of your presentations always?
Yes, of course.
Great. Nolan is backing you up in all the.
It's true.
Thank you very much.
Good, thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute stretch break. And